Good afternoon, and welcome back to Never Is Now, ADL's signature summit on anti-Semitism and hate. I am Tracy Labgold, and I am honored to be the moderator for diverse voices in the Jewish community. I have been involved with ADL, both in Florida where I live and nationally, for over a decade. ADL's dual mission encapsulates everything I hold dear, lifting up and protecting marginalized communities and my Jewish identity. Today, we will have a conversation about current issues through the lens of the diversity of the Jewish experience. We need to recognize and celebrate the fact that the Jewish people are extremely diverse and make sure that we amplify a wider range of the Jewish experience. You don't need me to tell you how crazy this year has been with the COVID pandemic, civil unrest, a reckoning with systemic racism and police brutality, and an election. There is enough to cover that we could be here until 2020 is finally over, but we will keep this to 1 hour. Before we hear from our speakers, I want to remind you to use the chat box feature to the right of the video to pose questions for the question and answer segment at the end of the session. Please type questions throughout the panel, and we will ask our panelists as many as time permits. In addition, please join in the conversation on social media by posting and using the hashtag #NeverIsNow. Now, let me introduce today's speakers. Dr. Ilan Shapiro was born and raised in Mexico City. Involved early in Boy Scouts and other socially driven organizations, he earned his MD and became the liaison between the World Health Organization and the Mexican Secretariat of Health. Following his training in pediatrics at Mount Sinai in Chicago, he helped develop binational projects to enrich the health of underserved communities. Today, he is a medical director in Southern California and has a passion to translate medicalish to a language that the community can use to choose health and wellness pathways. Dr. Joy Layden holds the Gottsman Chair in English at Yeshiva University, and in 2007 became the first openly transgender employee of an Orthodox Jewish institution. Author of 9 books of poetry and an excellent memoir, Through the Door of Life, A Jewish Journey Between Genders, and The Soul of the Stranger, Reading God and Torah from a Transgender Perspective. She serves on the board of Keshet, an organization devoted to full inclusion of LGBTQ Jews in the Jewish world. Rabbi Yonasan Peri was born in Tucson, Arizona, and raised by his Ashkenazi mother and non-Jewish Black father. He grew up in a secular home environment with minimal interaction with the Jewish community. When Yonasan turned 19, he was introduced to Chabad, which brought him to accept a life of Torah observance. After growing closer to Judaism, Yonasan spent several years in Morristown, New Jersey, pursuing Torah studies at the Lubavitch Yeshiva there. While studying in Morristown, Yonasan traveled to different yeshivas to educate students on the detriment of internal racism within the Orthodox Jewish community. Today, he lives in Los Angeles and is a rabbi. Before we engage in conversation, let's begin by listening to Rabbi Angela Buchdale's opening to her Yom Kippur sermon.
Are you Jewish? Are you Jewish? Are you Jewish? Are you Jewish? The Lubavitchers parked their mitzvah tank at the corner of my college post office. Remember those? And posed this question repeatedly like a jingle to students passing by. In the early 90s, Yale was about 25% Jewish. So asking, "Are you Jewish?" was like shooting fish in a barrel. Most of my Jewish friends were accosted multiple times each day. But not one time in 4 years did they ever ask me. I would have liked some free Shabbat candles, or to sit in their makeshift sukkah, or to have been acknowledged even once as a member of the tribe. And the Orthodox weren't the only ones who didn't recognize me as Jewish. I led the Reform Minyan. I chanted Torah. I read the entire liturgy in Hebrew, all while wearing a tallis. But inevitably, someone would come up afterward and ask, "Are you Jewish?" I know you're thinking, but Rabbi, surely you understand. There's a Jewish look, and you don't exactly have it. Jews are a people with Jewish last names, Jewish features. We even have our own genetic diseases. Yes, I did understand what the Jewish community was telling me. That Jewish peoplehood was akin to a race, something immutable and hereditary, an exclusive club you had to be born into. And even though I had a Jewish father, with this face, I would never really be Jewish. Jewish peoplehood is powerful and real, but too often we misunderstand what that means. So tonight, I want to debunk some of the myths around Jewish peoplehood. Beginning with, first, we Jews are not a race.
If you would like to hear the rest of Rabbi Buchdale's powerful sermon, and I highly recommend doing so, you can find it online. But we thought her opening very nicely set the stage for our discussion. So let's start with asking our esteemed panelists this. Imagine you are sitting around your Rosh Hashanah table for dinner 3 years from now, and you are asked, what was 2020 like for you? Dr. Shapiro, will you go first?
Gladly. I will be sitting with my kids. They will be 13, actually bat mitzvah for my daughter, 12-ish, and my son. And I will be singing a lot of the stuff and being grateful that with all the COVID stuff that we had and all the problems that we had, we were more united. And we actually tried to make sure that we amplify and help anybody that was around us, starting with us. We need to start making sure that our health is good, our soul is good, and after that, making sure that we help the community around us, no matter where we are. That I think that's kind of the feeling that I will have in 3 years.
Thank you. And Joy.
When I started thinking about this question, I realized already Rosh Hashanah feels like several years ago. One of the things that 2020 has been like for me is this sense that from week to week, my understanding of the world that I'm living in is different. It is nice to imagine being able to sit with other people around a table, though. So I'm guessing that things are better, we're imagining, 3 years from now. I think that I'm hoping from that vantage point, I'll look back and I'll realize that 2020 was a year when the precarity that we're supposed to make ourselves feel around the high holidays, the sense that our lives hang in the balance, that our world hangs in the balance, that each of our actions has power to repair the world, power to break the world further. To me, that stopped being something to do at a particular season, stopped being metaphorical, and started feeling literal. I felt that way as a citizen, that the way that I behave, the way that I speak, is either hurting my country, driving people apart from each other, or helping people understand and bring one another together. And as a part of an ecological system that is the entire world, I've realized that. And I would say as a spiritual, like as a religious person, I've realized that my fantasy that I have some kind of immutable core of values or goodness or something that I can rely on is not true. That all around me I see people who are also intelligent and also seem good and making decisions that sometimes seem crazy to me, and I have to look at that as a mirror and say, wow, I need to constantly be examining my actions because that's me also. So I'm hoping that I'm saying that from the feeling of like, and now things are less precarious, but nonetheless, I think that that there's a deep truth that I don't want to let go of, no matter how much better the world may be.
Thank you for that. And Rabbi.
So for me, 2020 has been an interesting year, obviously, but I like to think of it in particular terms that are like a catapult, right? Say that as every generation goes further and further, we become further removed from spirituality, from just basic things like that, but also in the past decade or so, even from each other, from from interactions, normal interactions with fellow people, and that one last pull down on this catapult will hopefully send us, you know, uh, skyrocketing forward in the sense of sometimes you go on, you wake up and you'll spend hours before you even have a sip of water, coffee, food, whatever it is. But let it be a fast day, right? When you're forced to not eat, drink, anything like that, you're thirsty, you're hungry. And for me, the past few years, the past decade really is, social media and phones, and you see a lot of studies that involved studies on people with their heads constantly down, or always on their phone, or always behind a computer, not really engaging with other people. The fact that we've been forced to live this way has kind of led a lot of people to missing human interaction, and I have hopes that when having this conversation, it'll be an explanation as to why people have become so close to one another again, and to valuing human interaction once again.
Thank you all so much. So since the presence of COVID hung so much over your opening remarks, I want to turn to the doctor first. Dr. Shapiro, you've been working on the front lines of COVID in a hospital in Los Angeles. Can you share how your Jewish values have guided you during this extremely difficult work?
It's quite interesting to have Ilan Shapiro and him, and when they come and I start speaking Spanish fluently, there's like this range of, okay, you're Ilan Shapiro, and you have all these things that are mixing and matching, and we're expecting something, and they go between them and go in Spanish, like, oh my God, he's speaking Spanish. Yes, I know that I'm speaking Spanish. And on reality right now, the Jewish values have been for all the activities that we're doing right now. The part of equity, equality, to make sure that everybody has a fair chance to survive, a fair chance to actually be preventing an infection that we're having right now. We're going right now to the streets with people that need help. There's a lot of elderly people around LA County and Orange County. We're trying to help them, driving them food. One of the things that we have been trying very, very highly is that, yes, there's COVID-19, but there's something called diabetes. There's other things called cancer prevention, even with kids. Then we're needing to make sure that we're creating, the important things of what's happening right now, but importance of the continuity, that I see that as part of the Jewish values of making sure that we're preventing problems for the future and we're learning. A lot of the things that we do in every day is making sure that we are sharing information and creating an open debate about it. And that's something that we do have a lot of on the Judaic, ideas, that we can share ideas. Maybe we don't like them that much, but the openness of sharing ideas on how to improve processes, how to protect our community has been amazing. And most importantly, how to protect ourselves. And I'm not talking about wearing a mask, social distancing. We know that we need to be doing that, washing our hands, we need to be doing that. But the part of waking up every morning, saying a prayer, making sure that we're giving thanks to God that we are here and we can do God's work and we can actually push it forward, and making sure that we are helping more people. My mission every day from the beginning until now has been to make sure that we're spreading as much education as possible, making sure that the values are there, and most importantly, to prevent from everything that we're learning right now, to prevent any problems for the future, in order for us to learn and be hopeful that we will be more joyful and healthy in the next coming months.
Thank you so much. Doctor, I have a lot of Spanish speaking friends, Jewish Spanish speaking friends, who say they've often received the same reaction. So I want to ask the rabbi, can you talk a little bit about your Jewish journey and share some of your thoughts on the real or perceived assumptions that people might make about you and how that affects your Judaism? Oh, Rabbi, I can't hear you.
If it's okay, I can. In the meantime that we're doing the sound check, I can share. You know, I always start with
Can you hear me now?
the jalapeno joke that I have a jalapeno stroking my throat. That way, you know, people understand that it's okay to be different. And I play a lot with the stereotype of what they were imagining at that moment, and trying to break that, you know, acknowledging that there's something different and it's okay. Let's put that on the back burner. Let's talk. Let's have a conversation now that we put that aside, because we're at the end of the day we're just humans, and that's one of the things that I have learned a lot. That even you know, coming here, having the accent, and I 85% of all my patients that I have treated here in the U.S., in Chicago, in Florida, immigrant communities here in LA County, Orange County, and they're Hispanos, and you know, creating that bridge of we are all together makes a huge difference.
Right. Can you
Yes,
guys hear me
learning to
now?
celebrate. We can. I was going to say, learning to
Okay,
celebrate
good.
difference instead of fearing it is so important. Rabbi, do you remember the question or would you
Agreed.
like me to repeat it?
I do. I do. Yes. So I grew up. You know, my mother's Ashkenazi. I grew up. You know, going to synagogue and things like that. You know, I've been asked several times about, you know, my, you know, when I converted, when I became an adult, or there were times when, you know, in my, you know, adolescence that I wasn't visibly, you know, observant. I wasn't observant at all at the time. That I would be kind of questioned or, you know, asked to prove, you know, saying a bracha or say Shema or whatever it was, um, you know, question like that, in, you know, but when I joined the, you know, the frum world, the Orthodox Torah observant world, I very seldom ran into any kind of things like that. Every now and then I would have, you know, the question asked of when did you know, convert? I guess the assumption was that I converted. Not that it's an insult to be a convert, but the assumption that because my, you know, ethnicity, my ethnic background maybe didn't match up to the generalized, you know, demographics of the Jewish world, that, you know, the question obviously was posed when I converted. And but other than that, and that was very seldom that ever occurred. But there's the obvious assumption that if you are not from, you know, an Ashkenazi background, a Sephardic background, a Mizrahi background, um, that there's some, at some point there was an inclusion that took place. There was a joining of some parent, some, you know, familial background that joined the Jewish people.
Thank you for that. Professor Layden, I know that identity is something that you think about, write about, and talk about a lot. I wanted to know if you had reflections on that. And also, I wanted to ask you, you are the first openly transgender professor at an Orthodox Jewish institution. How have you been received? How has your identity been received by your colleagues and your students?
Those are two very different kinds of questions. I just want to be clear, I'm not the first transgender employee of an Orthodox institution, but I do believe I'm the first openly transgender employee. In fact, although I'm not sure she realizes it, the dean of my college had a secretary who was also transgender but did not reveal that she was trans at the time. And so one of the things that is clear is that it makes a difference uh, when you ask a question like this: do people seem visibly different or do they not seem visibly different? Right? In relation and against what assumptions of normativity, right? If we're in an Ashka normative context, that's certainly what I grew up in. any Jew who was Spanish speaking or came from Mexico, or who had um, a parent of color. I mean, it was such a narrow view of what was normal, and I was completely unaware of it. The the way that trans people are looked at is against assumptions of um, gender normativity, and that sounds very abstract. Normativity is just like, what are people used to? When people think about who's us, what are the ingredients that go into recognizing who's us? It's a question that children have to learn. Who's part of my family? Who's not part of my family? It's the way that we understand who we are is by recognizing who are the people who help us be who we are. Those are the people who are us, and who are the people who are strangers. They're other people. They may be floating around, but they're not connected to us as intimately. When you have differences, and I'm saying when you have differences, when I am confronted with people who are different in ways that sort of fry my circuits of what's normal, um, I find it hard to recognize what the doctor was talking about, which is that common humanity, that common denominator of, well, there's a way in which we're all us. And I remind myself that that's often the way people respond to me. So one of the things is that there are people at my institution and people everywhere who look at somebody like me and they're like, no, that is not the way I understand humanity. Humanity doesn't have a slot for somebody who is like you in terms of maleness and femaleness and gender. Um, and there are other people who are just like, you know what, we don't know what to do with you, but we'd rather ignore it. And what I found that really transformed me at Yeshiva University is that some of my students took a third option. They said, when we look at you, we don't understand. Our tradition doesn't teach us what a person like you is. We don't understand what's going on. One of my students wrote me and she said, but it teaches us a lot about how to respond to people in pain. And I know you must have been in a lot of pain to be doing what you're doing, to be making this transition. And it was like scales fell from my eyes. And I was like, oh, Orthodox tradition, this core halachic Jewish tradition, does teach people how to respond to ways of being human that are completely unfamiliar. It says ignore the difference and look for the humanity. And that's not a modern or secular idea. That's an idea that is deeply embedded in values of Gemilut Chasadim, of Rahmanes, core Jewish and halachic values. And when I realized that, I realized, wow, my Orthodox Jewish students are teaching me to be not only a better Jew, but also a better person, a better queer person. Because if I'm going around freaking people out, presenting in ways that they don't understand, I need to be up my game in terms of responding to other people who are different in ways that I don't understand. And my students have shown me how to do that.
Thank you. I really appreciate the uplifting look on that. I'm going to change the conversation a little bit. We have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. I wanted to go back to the doctor. And as a Mexican immigrant, have you seen or experienced anti-immigrant comments or xenophobia? And how do you respond to them?
It's quite interesting because we started in Chicago as the first initial place that we were living at, and after that we moved to Florida. In Florida, we were on the west part of it, and it's not Miami, it's not Boca, it's not Orlando. It's actually real Florida. And when we had a lot of we started having a transitional part of different things happening in the U.S. and a lot of people were like, well, you're different. You're not like them. You're a different Mexican. And that took me far away from what I started with when I was young. You're a different Jew. You're a different person. And then, I started having this conflict that I thought that I already resolved in my life. There's a lot of questions regarding Judaism, the culture, a lot of things on the table, the religion. And when they were asking me there is that, we still do not, and I love how Joy actually put it on words, we still don't understand why we're hearing so much of things, and we are hearing them, but we do not truly understand them, and we want the 1 minute answer of what you are. And you're different because, I have been living with you the past 5 years, and you're part of our company, you're part of this, we're part of that. But the people that actually do not know, those are the devil ones, and you're different. Then I have heard that many times in many forums. A lot of times, it's opening the door on, what, the same way that, there's good people and bad people. You can choose, and you can feel the, like fill the blank. There are uh, uh, people that like telephones. There are and you can actually do exactly the same thing for absolutely everything. And when I scale down the conversation on that and tell them, what, um, there's much to be talked, and instead of, at the beginning, I was like very defensive and making sure that I stood my ground and making sure that I made a point out of it. On reality, it took a lot of energy, but right now I opened the doors and we're like, okay, let's talk about it. You're pointing out that there's a difference here. Let's talk about the difference. Let's see what we have. And a lot of the times they understood the point of being on going back to stereotypes, going back to whatever I had for 1 minute, whatever I read on Instagram, whatever I read in a social media account, that it was not even true. Then scaling back, making sure that the question, creating a dialogue, because right now, one of the things that I have learned from Mexico, in Chicago, Florida, here in LA, and Orange County, is that the only constant in life is actually, change. Then if we don't embrace that, and we don't create, pathways to understand the difference between everybody, we'll be all tantruming. We always we want, like, the difference, the things that are like, we feel secure, the things that look like us, and wasting a lot of energy on hatred and creating barriers that we actually, they don't exist. We are all humans, and that's why I do the job that I do and the work that I do. I'm the first, on the family actually to migrate here with my wife, and then my kids were born here, and we were the first ones to actually create that part. And that's why when I see someone that it's here and they need help in a different language, I open my arms. And it doesn't need to be Spanish; it could be Russian. I have patients that come from Middle East and other places. That's opening the door. That there's a lot of wind out there, a lot of things that I don't understand, but I'm open to learn more about you and where you're coming from.
Thank you so much for that. I think that oftentimes people feel safer if they can put us all in a box and not open up to a whole spectrum of diversity. Each of us is multifaceted, and I think we lose a lot when we try to narrow identities or peoples or cultures into very small spots. On this theme, Rabbi, I wanted to ask you, I've seen Jews call out anti-Semitism in the Black community, and I've seen people of color calling out racism in the Jewish community. I've heard Jewish people say that since we were marching on Washington, we couldn't possibly be racist. And it just seems to me like a lot of pointing fingers and playing defense. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
So I have to say that I can corroborate with both, that there's instances of both, racism in the Jewish community and anti-Semitism in the Black community, the non-Jewish Black community. And at the end of the day, a person's, affiliations or, certain actions or different things that they may have done for the other, specific demographic doesn't mean that a behavior, a phrase, some interaction doesn't come off as prejudice or offensive to the other. So there really is no, there's no free pass to saying this is my excuse for this behavior. There's no way that I could be considered whatever you're claiming that I offended you, and so I think in reality you have two very oppressed people, two people with a long history of of hatred and different things like that. But the nature of the oppression, the nature of the hatred, the nature of the interaction with people outside of their respective demographics is vastly different. And if I use this example that if you had several people, coming to a support group for victims or trauma, say post-traumatic stress disorder, it would be just in poor taste to respond to somebody else's story of their hate, their hurt, or their oppression, whatever it was that they went through, to respond with, what ifs, or, but what about mine? And I see that constantly from both groups, to be honest. And particularly with everything that, Black Lives Matter, for example, is not a new organization, but there's, with George Floyd, this has been a different caliber of reaction, Baruch Hashem. And as a result, with the quarantine and everything, kind of keeping people inside, keeping people, more forced to engage through social media, there's a lot of bravery that comes along with being behind a screen or being in a WhatsApp chat and not having to actually converse with people in person. So it's given people the ability to learn a lot about others, and the ability to learn a lot about themselves, about ourselves. And so I think what's important is that we stress compassion. The only answer to everything is compassion. Everybody has their thing that they go through, and if you're dealing with somebody in person, you don't respond the way that you do, the way that we do when we think of being in separate demographics as an entire identity. We take offense if you discuss an entire identity with a broad stroke, as opposed to offering new information. This year, I've kind of taken it upon myself to address people who, with differing points of view or perspective, with the sense of this person doesn't have all of the information. Let me calmly and respectfully educate them, and hopefully make a change that way, as opposed to just engaging in friction or in oppression Olympics. So I think compassion and education is the key to change, to effective change.
Thank you so much. I have a number of more questions, but some are beginning to come in from the audience. Before I turn to the audience questions, Dr. Shapiro or Joy, did either one of you wanted to respond to what the rabbi just said?
I just wanted to say that I noticed something in common between what the rabbi was saying and what Dr. Shapiro were saying, which is something that I've learned, and that is that when people experience anxiety and feel overwhelmed, and that happens when people are confronted with kinds of difference we don't understand. In the United States, it often happens when white people are thinking at all about racism and the history of racism, structural oppression, the suffering of Black people. That's often immediately overwhelming. We don't have the resources for it. It happens when some responses to trans people in traditional religious communities. There are a lot of ways in which differences provoke anxiety and a feeling of being overwhelmed. And one of the defense mechanisms that people have, that the rabbi and the doctor were referring to, is that when we're overwhelmed, we simplify. We fall back on binaries to simplify things. Human beings don't fit into any particular neat categories. We're always changing and moving around, and we're complicated. And in fact, people are offended if you say, "Oh, you're just a this." Like those are fighting words. But when we become anxious, we want to know who's us and who's them, who's white and who's Black, who's Jewish and who's not Jewish. And along with that oversimplification of humanity and reductivism, we often feel like this is a zero-sum game. As the rabbi said, it's like, well, it's either your suffering or my suffering. It's your history or my history. There isn't enough empathy or attention or understanding to go around. And I love that metaphor of the trauma support group. Imagine what a disaster it would be to say, look, only one person can be traumatized here, and it's me. So the rest of you have to shut up. as opposed to we're all here to recognize other people's trauma and to realize our own wholeness. Like, I'm traumatized, but when you're talking, I can draw on my reservoirs of strength and compassion. And that's healing for me, just as it's healing for me when you do that for me. So when we're anxious or overwhelmed, it's very hard for us to respond in those kinds of ways because we simplify, we put people into binary categories and feel like there's this zero-sum tug of war going on. And so what I found a good first step is to try to make gestures of understanding when you can, because I get scared, I respond this way, but when I can, if I can reduce somebody else's anxiety, I can sometimes get us both out of these kinds of reductive traps.
Thank you for that. I have a friend who has on her Facebook page um, a picture of a pie, and it says equality is not pie. You know, if there's less of some for you because I ate more than my share, and I always think it's an oversimplification, but it's a way to look at it. Like exactly like you said, we're not taking away from anyone else if we own our own. The question from the audience is, how would you like to be treated by others? For example, and I think it goes to all three of you. For example, would you prefer to have others acknowledge your difference or have others interact with you with quote unquote blindness?
I'm going to take this one up front. I love when they ask me questions. I want the conflict, and let me tell you why. I think that when we actually, we all need a little bit of growing pains in order to grow and have a lot of be the people that we are, and I think that having tough questions and answering them puts us in everybody actually in the entire communication, and actually from them to us to actually a united front. And everybody will understand better if we're not afraid of asking. Because there's a way that you can actually ask a question and it's like throwing like a knife, or there's a way that you actually just sharing your feelings, your questions. And I love what Joy actually was sharing with us, that when someone actually comes and asks really a really good question about what they feel they're not understanding, and we can actually go to a level that yes, you're Mexican and Jew, and you were living in Mexico City and you love tacos, and and you actually do gefilte fish with chili and stuff, and having those conversations and making it on a positive way where you're sharing what you are and what you believe and what you feel, and they're sharing the questions, doubts, fears, and most of us at the end of the day go like, oh, I want to try gefilte fish with chili, or you know what, that was interesting. Then Mexico City and being a Jew, how was it? Then it opens other chapters, and the usual 3 or 4 initial questions are kind of the top of the iceberg. Those are the conversation started. By the way, what do you do for a living? Do you work or study? Those are kind of the first questions, and then you start on the meat part, the changing part, the way where you can actually create value for humanity on the way that you're interacting with other people. But if we're just afraid of interacting and we're on a bubble, and yes, I'm Mexican and Jewish, I don't want to talk about it, or you know what, I feel very offended, you didn't know that we're Jews in Mexico, or then we start like again the play of and we're downsizing the power words of actually discussion and communication. Then that's where I think that it's the values that I share. And I always ask my kids, by the way, and my patients, they're like, I'm here as your server, I'm your waiters here, I'm going to give you the menu and you can choose what you want. Some days you will like something that it's not on the menu, sometimes you don't like that because you're allergic, but at least we are having a communication, we're having a conversation, and that's the only way that we can actually move forward.
Thank you.
I just
Rabbi,
wanted
or
to
Yeah, so
add. Oh,
I'll
I'm sorry,
share just
Rabbi. I was pausing. I wasn't sure. Please go ahead.
no, sorry. So, first of all, one of my closest friends is an Orthodox Mexican American Jew. So, I'm gonna have a conversation with him as to why he didn't suggest chilies on the gefilte fish. But moving on from there, I would say that I agree. I'm all for the conversation. Um, at this point, I recognize that people are still, there's a transitional period. people may not be used to seeing people outside of their usual boxes of what the Jewish ethnic identities are. But so conversation is obviously welcome. Whatever results in not ignoring my existence or our existence, that's what's most important. So I am not team colorblindness. I'm just not. I think I had a situation where I was in a Whole Foods and I was in the produce section and a young lady came up to me and said, excuse me, complete stranger. She said, I just want to tell you, I see you, and I don't think, hey, this is a different person. I see you, and you're no different than me. And I don't know, maybe it was a bad day. Normally, I just smile and say thank you, but for whatever reason, I responded. I said, you shouldn't have to not see me as a different person to accept me. It should be okay that I'm different, and you still accept me as if I weren't. But to ignore my differences is not okay. It's not the goal. So, but I recognize that it's almost like a transitional stage. If colorblindness was the step leading to accepting one another and celebrating our differences and getting to know each other's differences, then I think that's great. There's a person who's involved in trying to seek out the lost tribes, and one of the arguments that he made, he says, the conversation he had with a group of people who claim, to be from the descendants of the house of Israel, and they argue, I have to accept rabbinic Judaism and this and that. So not to get into that, my opinion on that, his response is, when a long lost, relative comes home finally after years, the first question you ask them isn't if they daven mincha already, or if they're still keeping kosher, right? That the first thing you do is hug them, welcome, let me meet your family, meet my family, tell me about your story, let me tell you about mine. This idea of inclusivity and loving one another, even in celebration with our differences, to know more about one another because of those differences, and also it can help to understand a circumstance differently. So, for example, Jews in America may not be very versed in all of the nuances of what it means to be black in America. However, black Jews in America know very well what the black experience in America is. So by having a conversation with somebody who's a black Jew, meaning we're Jewish, that is our identity. We are Jews. However, in America, a person with any black descendants, there was something called the one drop rule, where if you had any black ancestry during the days of segregation, you went to a black school. So regardless of the person's identity, if you're considered black in America, you're black, and you get the black treatment in America. So by having dialogue and by having conversation, a person can get to know these things. And so I'm actually part of an organization with several friends of mine who are all black and Orthodox. And we started an organization called Kamocha, and our whole thing is educating non-black members of the Jewish community as to our presence and to our experience and things like that. It's mostly for the black Orthodox Jewish community, but by having these dialogues and these conversations, the idea is that eventually not asking questions won't be because of trying to ignore my existence or not address the elephant in the room, but just because it's completely normal for me to be in the room.
I love that. Thank you. Joy, you had wanted to say?
Oh, yeah. I wanted to say that I really agree that curiosity is, I mean, I'm an educator, so I can't actually teach anybody who's not curious. It doesn't matter how brilliant I think what I'm saying is. If a student is not wondering about what I'm talking about, trust me, they are not learning anything. So the first step to understanding is curiosity, and human beings are naturally curious about differences from one another. Most of us are not great, actually, at figuring out how to tactfully ask personal questions. Honestly, it's not something I've ever been trained in. It's more like, oh, that was a bad choice, like a trial and error kind of thing. So it doesn't always go well. But in general, like when I came back to Yeshiva University, I kept my office door open, and there would be Nobody was ever rude to me. Nobody has ever been rude to me. None of the students were. But many of them really didn't know what to make of me. And there would be like these small knots of students outside my door. They thought I couldn't see them, but they were looking at me. They wanted to see what a person like me was. And that was curiosity. That was fine. They were trying to do it in a respectful way. They didn't want to make me feel burdened by their curiosity. At the same time, they felt they felt like they couldn't ask me questions. Partly because in the school environment you weren't supposed to say things like transgender or gay or queer. These were words that were from a secular world that was not, wasn't consonant with this. Even now, the school is not comfortable with this, and so that it didn't. I don't think anybody's colorblind in that sense with regard to me. I don't think anybody doesn't see me as different. But when people don't speak about one another's differences, I think it tends to harden into like a don't ask, don't tell policy. Differences become unspeakable, and colorblindness becomes a way of pretending that we've reached the stage the rabbi was talking about where we all know each other so well we don't have to ask. But actually, it's that we're the children at the Seder who don't know enough to even know how to ask the question. Because I'm a professor, I'm a professional educator. And so often I respond the way the doctor and the rabbi are. It's like, oh, good, you want to ask a question? Let's go. This is exciting. I'll learn about you. You'll learn about me. Together, we'll create more understanding of what it is to be human. But when I'm not in my professional capacity, when I'm just a person on the street, I don't have the armor of my fit title and my role and my degrees and all of this stuff. Sometimes I feel too vulnerable to do that. And sometimes somebody who is curious but not artful with a question. And I'm in a place of vulnerability or smallness, I guess, is what Jewish tradition would say. A place of, um, yeah, katnut, not gadlut. Sometimes it is hard for me to respond to other people's curiosity in a way that's positive. And I would say that some of the confusion around when you're supposed to be curious and when you're not has to do with the hard calculus of figuring out when the person that you're curious about is or isn't in a place where they can talk. And I think if we take it out of the realm of difference and we say, okay, you've just gone through a horrible divorce. I'm curious. How do I tell whether this is a good moment or not? To ask you about what you went through. And like we make those calculations with regards to other kinds of differences. And I think we can bring those same skills to not when I'm doing a talk as a professor or a professional, but when I'm there as an individual. You might look at me and say, wow, she looks a little sad. She looks like, right? There are times when it might be better and times when I might need something else from you, a different kind of recognition of my humanness. But as the rabbi is saying, I never want you to just look away like, oh, I don't know what to do with her. I'll pretend she's not there. That's never what I'm hoping for.
Yes, absolutely, because we all want to be fully seen. And I think in order to be able to fully see others, we have to be able to look into ourselves and to engage in that dialogue. And so for that, I'm so thankful for this conversation today. We're getting close to the closing, so I wanted to make sure that I had the opportunity to ask each of you to respond to this question. We know that racism and anti-Semitism and homophobia and xenophobia are issues that we need to be addressing within our Jewish community and in our society. There is a lot of work that still needs to be done. But I do want to end on a positive note. So what makes you hopeful for the future?
Oh, I actually have one that is amazing from my kid. We were watching a movie, and there's this scene on a beautiful lady. She's different color than the boyfriend, and the family completely disgrace her completely. And she goes with me like, Daddy, but why that happened? And I was going to do the whole spiel regarding what I think, and I asked her, what do you think that happened? Like, I think that they didn't like her hair because it was a little bit messy. then that's the next generation of kids that I want to see following us. The ones that actually will tell us the way that the world is as human beings, without colors, religions, and everything, that we're not fighting for that pie that it's there, that we're actually adding more pie to the table, that we actually can share that table, and we can actually share our where we're coming from, the stories, because trust me, we all want the same thing. We want to be safe. We want to be acknowledged. We want a better future for me as a person and for my community around me. And I think that nobody can actually destroy that, and nobody can go against that. Then we need to make sure that the next following years are coming in front of our lives, that we transmit that in our future generations.
Thank you.
So I'll say that I'm also hopeful in our children's generation, the next generation, because we're doing this work now. Growing up, looked to the leaders of the generation just before us, and also my teachers and Rabbi and different things that are doing the work that's necessary for us to succeed. And so the fact that we're focusing on the right things and we continue to kind of push that forward. And again, I don't speak for all Black Jews in the world, but from my perspective, I think that's the biggest thing is education. Biggest thing is education. And I'm sure both the doctor and the professor will agree with me that without education, we wouldn't be, as a Jewish people, who we are today and throughout history. And so I think we continue to do the work and let the next generation thrive and make sure that they have all the tools to do so.
I completely agree. I would say that what the doctor and the rabbi have said, that gives me hope. Honestly, I think everything that you've said is illuminating and point ways toward a better future, and I'm very grateful for the things you've said. A thing that is somewhat less recent that gives me hope is in the Torah, when God repeatedly tells the Israelites, when you get to the promised land and you see somebody who seems like a stranger to you, don't oppress them, because you know the soul of the stranger. And there's something a little crazy about that. It's like, yeah, you'd have to not be human to think people would ever respond that way. Like when we see people who are strangers, that's an opportunity to feel more comfortable being us. Oh, I'm part of this community. I know how things work. I belong here. It's a way of shoring up our own sense of identity. But God not only tells us to do the opposite, to say, when you see somebody who's a stranger, don't think about the comfortable ways you're a part of us. Think about the collective and individual memories you have of being in this position of being strangers. God believes that each of us can do that. And God believes that that can be central to the identity of an entire people, like a nation, which is a way of creating a sense of us on a large scale. God somehow believes you can build into the core of that nation the memory of having been strangers. It's paradoxical, but I think it is profoundly true, because I've never talked to anybody about my own rather unusual experiences of feeling like a stranger in a world of, binary gender. I've never had anybody indicate that they didn't. Most people can't relate to those experiences, but everybody tells me experiences that they have of their own, of feeling misunderstood, of feeling marginalized and left out. It's like that is the gender we all belong to. We can all access this part of us that is the soul of the stranger. And if we practice that spiritual discipline that's planted in the Torah and repeated over and over again, I think there's always hope.
Wow. This is so powerful. I really appreciate your thoughts and your energy so much. It has been a real honor and a pleasure to spend the past hour with you. Thank you for your insights, for your vulnerability, for your willingness to share. Our guests, before you go, please post about today's panel using the hashtag #NeverIsNow. And please visit the Never Is Now website to see the full slate of panels from subject matter experts around the country. You can visit https://events.adl.org/neverisnow/agenda to attend sessions. And if you're interested in seeing a session that has already happened, the same site will house all past panels, so you can watch everything. I know some of them are running concurrently, so you have the opportunity to go back and revisit. Never Is Now resumes on Thursday, November 19th at 2 p.m. And very excitingly, my clock must be wrong because I just got an internal message saying that we still have a couple of minutes. So if there's any other closing remark, I know, I'm very excited. If there's any other closing remarks you'd like to make, I offer you the opportunity. I'm going to just check the chat for other questions.
If I may, one other thing that I was burning an idea that the way that we learn, I can actually be teaching you about Torah and values and everything, and suddenly I trash the book on the can and I burn it, and after that I start like eating all the stuff that I have around me, and I do negative stuff. The teaching will be more on the actions that I actually creating on my community and the way that kids are actually learning than us as a community, as the adults of the community. And that could be a kid, that could be an adult for an adult. The point is that at the moment that we're teaching right now, we need to be teaching with action. We need to actually teach our kids, future generations, and actually our entire community, no matter where they are, with action. With a positive change. We are here. We want to have a dialogue, and the Rabbi and Joy actually made very clear in my mind that it's not about their suffering, my suffering, or they're the victims or I'm the victim. Is that we all want the same thing. We need to start creating that bridge, because it's not the African, the African American story or the Jewish story or the Mexican story or the Hispano story. It's the story. And that's actually what makes us all powerful, the diversity that we have here. And that's what I hope that we can teach with action to our future generations.
I agree.
Yeah,
I think
could
the
just
importance
add
of
this.
lifting one. Yes, Rabbi, please.
No, just to end my thoughts on, again, reiterating the idea of compassion. That Rambam says that anybody who does not live with midas chasadim and is kind to others and treats people fairly, that we question their yichus, we question their lineage, because that's one of the fundamental identifying characteristic traits of being a Jew. And if we're supposed to be, or legoyim, a light to the nations, that's what we lead with. If that's our characteristic, our identifying characteristic trait is to be compassionate, then that's what we need to lead with. And hopefully everybody else will follow suit, but it's up to us to lead the way.
I hope that you, Rabbi, won't feel that I'm misquoting here, because when Dr. Shapiro was talking, I was thinking about these many stories of the Baal Shem Tov, who would teach by telling a story, and when people would walk by, they'd catch a bit of the story and they would be rooted to the spot, not because of a magical power, but because it seemed to them that the story he was telling was the story of their lives. And I feel that that is such a profound example, and what Dr. Shapiro was calling us to imagine was a way that we can listen to other people's stories and share our own stories that leads us to see that we're all contributing to this larger unfolding story of humanity. That really, when you're telling your story, you are telling my story. You're enabling me to understand the story of my life by understanding, not by erasing your difference or saying you're just like me, but by understanding you, the story of my life is growing.
Thank you. That was beautiful. So, on that note, I think it's important to remember B'Tselem Elohim too. God knows what God is doing, and we are all created in God's image, and therefore each of us showed up just the way we were supposed to be. And we need to look in our hearts and find love for everyone in their embodiment of who they are truly meant to be. This has been an incredible hour. I am so grateful for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you,
Pleasure.
both of you.